Good morning and welcome to today's Savvy Investor webinar in partnership with LGIM. My name is Christy Lindsay and I'm responsible for institutional distribution at LGIM, and I'm also your moderator for today. I'm delighted to be joined by Bill Hughes, LGIM's Global Head of Real Assets, as well as NTR's CEO, Rosheen McGuckian, and their Asset Management Director, Joe Dalton. Bill leads LGIM's 40 billion real assets business, and he's responsible for all the spectrum of real assets investments, including those in infrastructure and clean energy. NTR has built and managed close to 3 gigawatts of wind, solar, and energy storage projects over a 2-decade period. And in her time as CEO of NTR, Rosheen has led its very successful deployment of investor funds into clean energy assets across 50 locations through their first 2 European clean energy funds. Joe is responsible for their team of engineers who actually construct and operate the projects, making sure that they deliver optimum returns. And he'll bring a real hands-on technical perspective to the discussion today. Together, LGIM and NTR have been working on harnessing and bringing the opportunity in Europe's energy transition to investors. And today, we will be discussing energy independence in Europe as a topic, a broad topic, which has never been more at the forefront of investors' minds than in the current landscape. The resultant pricing volatility and impact that has had, as well as broader economic outcomes. And we'll focus importantly on the opportunities that gives for investors to access private asset returns in the renewables space, as well as the critical importance of how we measure ourselves in a sustainable world. So without further ado, let's get into today's session. Firstly, energy independence, such a broad topic, and one that I said has never been more under the spotlight than today. And I'd like to start by asking you, Bill, in your role running a global real assets business, how is this impacting what you see and hear from investors and what really matters to them today?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. Yeah, of course, investors are highly sensitized to what's happening in the world at the moment. Global events always on the mind. And right now, I would say the Ukrainian conflict is a particular issue that's shaping thinking. The Russian aggression we've seen has highlighted the risks of energy dependency, not just in terms of the magnitude of that dependency, but also in terms of the potential risks involved in the dependence upon a state-controlled organization that's now been seen as a bad actor. So against that background, Christy, in terms of context, at LNG, we've been on a path of reducing resilience on oil and gas as part of our approach to decarbonisation. And we've been looking for investment opportunities in clean energy long before Ukraine, motivated really by transition to net zero and financial returns, but also critically energy independence. And that said, what's happened in recent months in Ukraine has certainly amplified the significance of thinking about global politics and thinking harder again about energy independence. I think against that background, a couple of final comments. Energy flexibility will play a big part in energy independence with interconnectors, energy storage, smart energy management, and all of those parts of the supply chain and energy will come more to the fore. But critically, energy independence will drive a desire to invest in local generation and storage. And at LNG, we're committed to doing more in this space.
Thank you, Bill. I'd like to ask a similar question to Rosheen and on what your perspective is on how recent events will affect the pace of Europe's energy transition.
Yeah, I mean, I think just following on from what Bill said, and good morning, everybody. Europe is very clear now that the fastest, most cost-efficient way to gain energy independence is actually to accelerate the deployment of local-based wind and solar, in particular renewable energy. And so they're very much saying wind and solar will play a central role in all of this. The targets were already very ambitious by Europe. They were saying we need the guts of 480 to 500 gigawatts of wind and solar between now and 2030 in each technology. But now they're saying we need to accelerate this. We need to front load the deployment of this and increase it, they're saying, by about 20% in the next couple of years. So that brings us to a point now where the deployment of renewables between now and 2030 every single year needs to be 3 times the pace of deployment that we've been seeing in the previous number of years, which is just huge. And I think, picking up on what Bill said as well, it's not just about new sustainable generation. It's also about this, what you call baseload or indeed storage, which is when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, where's the power going to come from? And EU dependence on natural gas is a real problem for us. So EU is now saying we need to accelerate the deployment of green hydrogen in particular, but it's not yet commercialized. So we will, in the immediate term, see a lot more imports of liquefied natural gas as investment into the commercialization of hydrogen, and in particular green hydrogen, catches up.
And interesting there, you use the word commercialization. Now, naturally, the acceleration of pace or exploring the slightly different types of technologies is likely to have an impact on price, I would expect. How do you think that's playing out both today across the spectrum of renewables and also is likely to in the more longer term?
Yeah, well, price of power has definitely gone up. We all know this. We can see it in our own electricity bills at home. But that price of power is more driven by the fact that there is an anxiety and an actual shortage in terms of natural gas and other gases, or I should say energy products that we've been relying on. To give you a feel for things, if we look at wholesale prices, the monthly average day ahead prices that we saw in March are roughly 5 to 6 times what we would have seen in March of last year. So, for example, if you look at Italy and the UK, last year the wholesale prices there might have been in the 60 euros and 60s. Now we're talking about over 300. Or in the Nordics, in certain areas, which would have been around 140 euros, it's now, or so 30 euros, it's now up to 140. In NTR, we're locking in prices around 2.5 to 3 times that we would have got a few months ago, up to 3 years ahead. And that's going to spill into, as you say, Christy, as we're building new renewable energy, in terms of auction bids that we'll be making. Those bids are definitely increasing. And indeed, corporate PPAs, which is another form of revenues for our sector, they are rising. Companies are rushing in to manage their long-term energy price volatility. And we in NTR, for example, are seeing our own experiences around 15 to 20% increases in just a couple of months. So in the short term, you're definitely seeing energy prices rise, but it will stabilize over the longer term as the most cost-efficient form of power, which is renewable energy, then penetrates even further onto the grid around Europe.
And of course, we can't talk about rising prices without the broader concept of inflation, which is affecting us all right now in many ways. And I'd like to ask Bill what your perspective is just on how you're seeing that affect infrastructure and the broader asset class of real assets at an overall level.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. Of course, yeah, inflation is on the minds of all investors right now. It's with us in a way that we haven't seen really for a very long time, and prevalent in all sorts of ways. So within real assets, the business I'm responsible for, we do think we have a particularly important role to play in terms of the ability to provide protection against inflation. In the world of infrastructure, infrastructure investment is well placed to provide that inflation protection, partly in terms of contractual inflation linkage, but also in terms of pricing power, which is a feature of the sector. But it's also worth saying another way of thinking about inflation protection is to find specific assets that can provide inflation-beating returns. And I would argue that in today's market conditions, investment in private assets holds great appeal because their exposure to long-term structural trends and also the potential to receive a premium for complexity or illiquidity is actually really appealing in the context of wider portfolios. So I think we have a really important role to play with regard to rising inflation.
Thank you. And if I would like to bring Joe into the discussion at this point, because we talked at an overall level, but at the very beginning, we discussed that in your role in actually constructing and operating the assets, how are you seeing this play out in the cost of actually building and running these assets in such an inflationary environment?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. It's a really interesting question. I suppose, when we look at inflation, I suppose as an engineer, the first thing that hits me is the fact that prices of basic commodities are rising hugely and very rapidly. Lithium is up 400%. Wind turbines have increased in price by 20 to 25% in the last 6 months, primarily driven by steel, but also things you wouldn't expect, like bunker fuel, which is the fuel used to transport equipment around the world. That's up very significantly. When you add that to shortages caused by a lack of crews, 15% of all the maritime crews in the world are either from Russia or Ukraine. We see significant price increases, and they have to be factored into our investment cases on what we do on the ground. And clearly what we have to do as engineers then is to minimize risk by doing whatever we can to hedge in quite difficult markets, but also and advise on when to do that, but also optimize how we actually build our assets, which is something we input. Then following on from that, the inflation hits. And where we see that basically is in our contractual relationships with our suppliers. Now, happily, they're a relatively small proportion of our revenue, and when we see our energy prices increase, that covers us. But the important point here, and I think it's really important to stress, is that our main suppliers have been suffering for a period of time. The likes of your GEs and your Vestises and your large turbine suppliers have been pushed right down to the bone, and need the opportunity to be able to invest some of their profits back into research and development to further improve their products. And I think it's timely that in this bout of inflation, that their need for this investment to optimize their products is also recognized. So I believe fundamentally what renewables and storage can offer combined is stability and a way forward that's sustainable. And they're the key things for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And you just used the word sustainable there, and I'm thinking to myself that before we delve into the opportunity, we've talked a lot about the market backdrop, the political landscape that's affecting this sector. But one of the biggest or most critical aspects when I talk to clients, and one of the questions we're constantly asked is, how do you hold yourselves to account under the banner of sustainability? And that's a word that is used a lot these days. And what I think clients really want to know is, how do I know that you are doing the job I asked you to do? And how do I measure you? What does SFDR mean? How can we help clients navigate what the real impact is of making these types of investments? And Bill, I'd like to just ask you for some kind of comments on how LNG and in your role, you are thinking about making this easier for clients and showing them that you are doing, what we say we will.
Yeah, it's a really important area, Christy. And so by way of background, the business I'm responsible for has been looking at sustainability for more than 15 years. But recent times, the criticality of that issue has really come to the fore. Now, asset owners and investors are working hard on defining their approach to ESG, partly as a response to that regulatory pressure that you talked about there, but also because of the increase of high quality and consistent data. That's all improving. And so we're having to evolve. I would say at LNG, we've moved already for some time way beyond just target setting. We've moved towards measurement and disclosure, and we're making it absolutely clear to our investors that we should be judged by our actions. And so our goal is to make sure that we measure, disclose and share with our investors precisely what we're doing so that they can, as you say, absolutely hold us to account. The SFDR regime, I'm sure everyone knows the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, another four-letter acronym. That is also shaping how fund managers behave. As you'll know, there's a taxonomy there and a number of different classifications. In the world of sustainable investment, we are aiming for Article 9 in a number of areas. It's challenging, but we think deliverable and achievable. It's again about setting objectives, but the disclosure and the measurement and the clarity of what we're doing in regards to social impact investing is really what that's all about. So I'm pretty excited about where we've got to as a business, but it is challenging and we need to continue to be alert to the subject here, move forward and really be in the vanguard.
Yeah, maybe if I could just expand a little bit on what Bill is saying and to talk about it just at a very practical level. I agree with everything that Bill says. SFDR is obviously, for Article 9, you need to demonstrate that you have climate impact, but it's a lot more than that. You really have to earn Article 9 when it comes to SFDR, because you've got to demonstrate as well that you have a clear understanding of both the impact that you make, but also the long-term sustainability risks that are associated with any investments that you make. So when you're investing in clean energy, you are investing in critical infrastructure that's firmly embedded within local communities. It's very visible and it's very much there. And so when we look at the whole world of ESG and SFDR, we have to think right from the investment decision, the whole way through construction and operations, what are both the risks and what are the impacts, both positive and negative, I would say, in terms of sustainability. So in practical terms, we're talking about what are we doing about biodiversity on site? What are we doing about habitat? How's the community being affected, both during the construction period from a safety point of view, or maybe noise longer term? We're looking at our choice of suppliers. Do they sign up to UN Global Compact principles? All of these things, and also ultimately looking from an investment point of view to say, are we locating the assets in a place that's going to be flooding, or we'll have extreme weather events? All of these factors at a very practical level you've got to understand, and as Bill said, demonstrate transparently to investors that you do understand and you're measuring it and you're on top of it.
And thank you, Rosheen. I think that from a investor's point of view provides a lot of comfort that it's not just about measuring what you're doing at an overall level. It's in the core and the fabric of every single decision you make, every step through the process. And I do think that perspective provides a lot of comfort. And one thing that strikes me as we talk through all of this is just how specialized a lot of this sector is. And again, thinking, from an investor's point of view, looking to, put capital to work in this space, thinking about how to do that and who to work with. Joe used the phrase as an engineer and having that specialist skill set. Joe, how important do you think that mindset has been to you and is for investors in working with someone like yourselves?
Lindsay, I think it's absolutely critical, and I think you've touched on the core of the issue. And Rosh has explained a number of the factors. For me, and for all of NTR, it's always been about the life cycle. In engineering, we call it terra technology, where we look right through from the start, the inception of a product, to understand exactly those factors that are going to impact in a positive, but also have to be mitigated. So Rosh has spoken to things like noise, and they're absolutely critical. We have issues, potentially that we have to manage with shadow flicker from wind turbines, with glint and glare from solar products. But also, we need to look at the factors that are going to minimize the risk to the actual build of the product. So we do a lot of preparatory geotechnical work to de-risk a project. We do micrositing to optimize the efficiency of a project. We do a variety of things that, frankly, unless you have that engineering skill set, you're not going to understand or certainly have sufficient opportunity to change before somebody else has done them for you. And frankly, sometimes we have to make balances between cash yields and IRR to make sure that projects deliver what we say they will, which can lead to decisions about, for example, solar overbuild. We look carefully at electrical connections to ensure that we don't have excessive constraint and curtailment now and potentially into the future. And these are issues that, you know, you can't really put into an Excel spreadsheet until you fully understand the implications of what you're doing. Then in terms of operations, the trick then is to maximize availability by understanding what best to contract out to other parties in terms of risk management, but also what to do yourself to minimize risk with core critical asset infrastructure, for example, like main transformers, to ensure that you can minimize the possibility of failure of those products. So for me, it's about returns optimization, but also risk minimization and identification of critical assets and the management of those assets in the best possible way.
Thank you, Joe. And it's also, I think, from an investor's point of view, just so interesting to hear kind of the passion in which that you speak about the work that you do, because you're so involved and on the ground, and it's integral to kind of, you know, who you are. Is really interesting as an investor. But despite that, it certainly feels that, despite the specialized nature of it, it feels that it's a sector or an asset class that's become really popular and competitive of late. So I'd like to ask Rosheen your view on how, in light of a more competitive landscape, you still continue to find the right transactions and pockets of value to extract for investors.
Yes. Look, I think a lot of it's down actually to the very work that Joe and their team do, because we lean a lot on the engineering team in order to find those additional pockets of value at the diligence stage and in terms of redesign. So first of all, I'd say if you've been in the market for a while, you do have experience in and if you've experience in developing and constructing projects, you build up a reputation of a party that has low execution risk. So you do have an opportunity to speak with potential vendors that perhaps people who haven't been around for so long wouldn't have access to. And we find that we then work with these vendors to help find new pockets of value, or indeed perhaps even to help them overcome potentially fatal issues that they would have seen as an issue that the project's going to die from a planning perspective. And we might say, well, actually, if you look at it this way, or perhaps you adjust your planning, there's still a project and there's still value to be had. But Joe already mentioned things like micrositing, what you call overbuilding for grid connection. You could maybe redesign solar layouts. There's a lot of stuff that we can do alongside a vendor, even before we've acquired a project, working with them to say, look, here's something that we can see there's additional value, which we can share in a competitive environment. They'll take some, but we also have enhanced value then on behalf of our investors. So as I said, actually lean a lot on Joe and his team to help us find those areas, to enable us to, as I said, to share it, and everybody gains.
I think, Rosh, just to add to that, we have a term in NTR called the boomerang asset, Lindsay, which is one that tends to come back to us maybe again and again. And people, you know, and parties that we have relationships with now have realized that when we do diligence, sometimes we know more than other people. And when we point it out to them, and then when further diligence happens, other people run away scared. And we're able to pick up certain assets that way. And then people come back to us for repeat business.
The importance of established relationships and being core in the sector, I guess. So the last topic that I really wanted to think about before we move to questions is the future of this sector, what it looks like, and where the opportunities are. So Joe, wouldn't you mind just giving some thoughts on what you think the future of the renewable sector might look like?
Absolutely. So I think, you know, we've all seen that the European appetite for renewable energy, and clearly the two front runners there are onshore wind and solar. But we also need to be very cognizant of the fact that offshore wind is going to become a very significant player. There is still further development to happen in the whole floating offshore sector, and also potentially, and almost as importantly or more importantly, the high voltage grid sector for transporting that power onshore. So HV transmission offshore is going to become a huge thing. Repowering technology is going to be a very, very important factor onshore, where we can actually significantly increase the output from existing wind farms just by making relatively modest modifications. I think people talk about hydrogen, and again, I'd stress as an engineer, I look at hydrogen as being green gas, and I'd put actually ammonia in the mix there as another vitally important gas product that we need to be looking at for storage purposes. Potentially also, Lindsay, I think we're going to be looking at offshore pump storage. And I think if we really start getting ambitious and serious about things, what we can do is harness some of the technologies that are developing right now for offshore pump storage, which are, in my mind, far more significant than onshore pump storage, just in terms of the available resource. Finally, there are huge benefits taking place. And sometimes people read, a 2% increase in efficiency in solar panels from things like perovskite. I think it's vitally important for people to recognize that that's a huge hurdle, or a huge uplift in efficiency when we talk about going from potentially 21% to 23% efficiency on solar panels. It's a 10% gain. So those types of developments are going to become absolutely vital. In my mind, renewables will be nothing without storage to an extent. And we have to get the balance right there to get people stable power prices.
And perhaps a last word for you, Bill, then, on where you think that leaves the opportunity for investors in the future.
Yeah, thanks. I just really want to present this as being a very exciting moment, really. At LNG, we have a social purpose. We're trying to do something that is useful to society. We're trying to do the right thing with long-term capital we represent, so that the future is a better place. And for long-term investors that want to make a difference, the renewable energy sector is an opportunity of a lifetime. There's inevitably a huge volume of investment needed to transition to a far greater proportion of renewable energy within economies. And as things stand, there is a scarcity of assets in which to invest. So the real opportunity is investing in the improvement of existing assets that Joe and Rosheen have talked about, or being involved in procuring the new renewable assets of the future, and including the new and growing related opportunities that exist in local energy storage. So it really is a fantastically exciting opportunity for long-term capital that wants to make a difference.
Thank you. And I'm seeing a lot of questions come in, actually, on the opportunity itself and how it can be accessed, which is fantastic. But I'll move on to the questions now. And the first one that's come through that I'd like to ask to Joe is, what potential is there to harness energy from tidal power? Could you just give a few remarks around tidal as a potential source?
Sure, Lindsay. So there have been well, the first thing to say is tidal power comes in kind of two forms. One is where the actual tide level increases, and that's harnessed by pumping the water as the height increases to when it reduces. So it's captured and then released through a hydropower equipment, like a pump in reverse. The second type then is tidal flow. And basically what that involves is using equipment quite similar to a wind turbine, but underwater. So there is potential, and there are potential resources around the world, particularly with potential energy sources. You need to identify the particular locations, and it's critical then to understand the impact on nature that causes. You know, if you're going to dam up a fjord, with the view to producing energy from it, you need to be absolutely certain you're not doing more environmental damage. The point I'd make, though, first is that we probably have so much potential from from wind and from solar, that the cost of producing the equipment that harnesses tidal energy becomes relatively prohibitive, or it has to date. I'm not saying it will always be that way, but so far it's proven relatively difficult, both in terms of tidal harnessing and also even wave energy harnessing has been relatively difficult to date. I'm not saying it won't be done, hasn't been done yet at commercial level.
Thank you. And you mentioned there that there's still so much to be done in wind and solar and storage. We talked a little bit about those in the body, but one of the questions is asked a bit more about the differences between risks and returns across those. And I guess back to the question of what happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I guess in terms of risk and return, one of the key factors we need to understand as asset managers is how certain are we that we're going to produce the amount of energy? Will it do what it says in the tin? So we need to be very critical. And I know Rosh sometimes, our investment team can sometimes get a little bit frustrated when Joe, the engineer, comes in and says, actually, I have concerns about X, Y, and Z in terms of wind resource. That being said, I think with the modicum of expertise that we have in-house, we can mitigate that risk and reduce the potential for us to underperform from the wind quite significantly. In terms of solar, it's a heck of a lot more predictable. And part of the reason for that, Lindsay, is that there typically tends to be a lot of overbuild. In other words, more panels and producing DC, or with the potential to produce DC electricity than we have inverters to convert it to AC. And as a result, there's a slight buffer there that can ensure that the risk of underperformance is lower. As a result, there tends to be a marginally lower return on investment from solar projects. They're also simpler to develop and they're simpler to locate, just by virtue of the fact that the visual amenity is less impacted by them.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask, I guess, Rosh, if you've got any comments on that topic at all. I know one of the things that as a manager you spend time thinking about is blending a strategy to allow for differences between the different types of renewable sources. Is that something you think is important for investors to think about?
Yeah, we do. I'm very conscious. It sounds like Joe and I just keep talking about wind and solar, but actually the primary reason is that from a levelized cost of electricity perspective, they are the two technologies that at present do provide the most opportunity for further deployment and further investment, and certainly within the European region and actually globally, to be honest with you. So the way we look at it is wind is, from a technology point of view and from a resource point of view, a little bit more complex than solar is. So therefore, the returns are going to be slightly higher, but you've got to kind of understand it a bit better. What we try to do with those two technologies on a blended basis is to have a little bit more emphasis on wind than solar, but we still like the two together in a combined strategy, even just for seasonality of earnings. So if you take European winters and European summers, you want to be able to get, good, cash yields in the summertime as well as the winter. Tied up with that is energy storage. We like to sort of do a blended generation plus storage story together. And the reason for that is exactly what Bill pointed out at the very beginning. It's about the flexibility, it's about the base load coverage, and it's also about arbitrage and being able to get, the optimal prices at the right time when the wind isn't blowing and the sun doesn't shine. So that's kind of how we look at the three technologies together. And there are other technologies coming behind, obviously, which would be more niche. I don't say coming behind. They're out there, but they're more niche. You could have energy from waste, you could have biomass, you could have different areas. They are more complex. They bring on different risks in terms of feedstock and certain areas like that, and actually the ability to get the levels of efficiencies that you expect in your business case. And then the assumption is you need to get the higher returns in order to offset that. From our own perspective, we feel that the real opportunity today from Europe in terms of the scale of what's deployable and the right kind of risk-adjusted returns would be a sort of a wind, solar, energy storage combination. We feel that's a very attractive risk-adjusted strategy for investors.
Thank you. We've got quite a few good questions come through, so I'm going to try and find time to go through as many as we can. Another one that perhaps both for Rosheen and Bill, a broader question on what are the biggest obstacles that you see to investment in decentralized renewable energy technology, and how might those be overcome?
Bill, do you want me to go in first, or you shoot? Okay, I'll start. From a decentralized perspective, I'm talking in the context of Europe. One of the issues we face is that the grid infrastructure is not set up for decentralized renewable energy. You can, of course, a large aspect would be rooftop solar, and I think Bill might want to talk to that with sort of the real assets background, and that's certainly one area. But in terms of getting significant capital out the door fast, you tend to kind of work towards utility level rather than very decentralized. And in addition to that, our grid infrastructure is set up that it's actually more difficult to be as decentralized as you might be in a brand new situation, such as an emerging market, maybe one of the African markets, where you could start decentralized from the very beginning. So that's just one perspective.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I think it's a really important point to get your head around here. In the end, the built environment for any individual living in it is relatively local, and so I think you have to look through the lens of what does it mean at a local level if you think about the built environment, including energy, and very much with an emphasis upon renewable energy. And the reason I have talked quite a lot as we've gone through about local generation and storage is because that's a much, much bigger part of the future. That's what sustainability will look like. One of the critical elements from my perspective as head of real assets is to think about the built environment holistically. So we're talking about where do people live, work and play, where does the energy come from, where is it produced? And I think this rooftop solar approach and local energy, ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, wind, how that connects to communities at a local level is really critical. And so we need to get our arms around that approach, and as Rosh has indicated, increasingly be less dependent on the grid. And it comes really back to your very first question, which is about independence in energy. I think that goes to a local community level ultimately, not just from a country national point of view. I think it has to percolate down into regions and areas much more so. So that's the way to think about it going forward, no doubt. More decentralization at many different levels, actually.
Thank you. Another question that I think is coming in more than once, and it seems to be kind of at the forefront of people's minds, is about supply demand here in terms of the opportunity. Globally, we're seeing billions of euros chasing this energy transition. Just, is there enough? I guess that's an open question, probably again. Yeah.
Yes, there is. I mean, I'm going to focus in Europe. There is a $1 trillion, or about a 900 billion euro opportunity in Europe between now and 2030 in what is required. The supply demand is through the planning stages in time to meet the requirements that we have. There is a lot of new stage development going on across multiple markets in Europe, but a lot of it is getting delayed more than you might like. And it's about finding the opportunities within that to see, well, what can be moved along quicker? And that's part of what we do. What I would say, and I think what's very, very helpful, is that Europe, from a policy point of view, particularly since the energy independence issue that we now face, are recognizing, look, we've got to sort this planning issue out. In fact, it even set out a directive as long ago as 2018 around certain planning log jams, requirements for countries to make decisions within 2 years and so on. And not all countries transpose that. So now there's a whole new sort of push. So you've got to transpose this. You've got to find ways to get planning through those log jams quicker. So there's going to be, I won't use today, I could go on for hours about this, but if everybody watch out for measures that are going to be published by Europe in about 2 weeks' time around what we need to do to get planning through quicker. Development is definitely happening, but it's about being able to get more of it through the planning process quicker to enable it to get built.
Thank you. I think we've probably only got time for one more question. So I'll pose this to Joe, which is a very specific question on how you view the LCOE of pump storage versus battery storage as backup to wind and solar.
Lindsay, well, that's a very specific question, and what I'd say is what pump storage. Okay, so in my previous role as head of asset management for ESB, I actually managed a 500 megawatt pump storage station, which had been built in 1969 to 1971, and I know that because I went there as a 4-year-old. We couldn't actually justify refurbishing our pump storage station at the time. So, and why was that? It's because economics sometimes drives engineering. And to me, stability needs to come the other way around. We need to understand what it is that we need to engineer to provide stable prices and get away from burning fossil fuels of all forms. I see somebody else may have mentioned natural gas. I believe there's still a place for it. We'll need it for a time to come. But in terms of this specific question, pump storage could be built onshore. It can also be built offshore, and there's massive investment now into offshore technology for pump storage, which I think will have a place. I think the problem with pump storage is more about siting than anything else. It's about finding locations onshore, if you're going to do it, to put large-scale pump storage, which does make sense. When you talk about as a backup, though, I remember we have one pump storage station in Ireland. It's the one I mentioned, which is 500 megawatts, and it has an 8-hour storage capacity. We'll need to blend pump storage, probably flow battery storage, which is something I hadn't mentioned earlier, and fast response, combine them with wind and solar, both onshore and offshore, to solve this problem. Will we become net neutral in terms of carbon emissions? I don't believe so, but we could probably get back to 1920s levels, and that's very achievable. So I think there will always be a place for some fossil fuels just by virtue of emergency. And I think what we need to do as an industry is look very carefully at the types of fossil fuel that we use to support renewable energy going forward. And then I think ultimately that renewable energy will become the price maker rather than the price taker. But that's where we need to transition to.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sorry for asking you such a niche question there at the very, very end, Joe. So I think I'll squeeze one more in to just kind of round the session off and take us back to, we talked about sustainability and how critical that was to investors. And given there's such an abundance of actions required to achieve net zero, if priorities had to be made, which aspect of the energy transition would each one of you focus on? And I think we'll leave that as a final question before we wrap up. So I'll start with you, Rosheen, please.
Planning. Get the planning sorted.
Okay. And Joe?
Well, I agree with Rosh, but when we get there, we need to have storage. And we need to have 3 times as much renewable energy on the grid as we do baseload power. And then we need to have a place to store it for when the wind don't blow and the sun don't shine, Lindsay. And it's got to be, we'll take a lead on that, but we're not going to bleed on it. Sorry, yeah.
It's okay. And the last word to Bill, please.
Yeah, so I think I'll cast the net a little bit more widely in a sense. For an investor in the built environment, it's worth emphasising the single biggest factor as we transition to net zero is residential retrofit. And that's about the art of making the existing housing stock fit for the future through modification rather than replacement. And when you look at that, there is absolutely no doubt at all that the big issue is renewable energy and transmission and storage at a local level, and that's a critical part of solving the biggest issue that this government and this investment industry faces. We've lost our main chair of the event, but look, I wanted to say to everyone who's joined us, I hope you found that interesting. You'll see that NTR and LGIM are organisations that think about things to some extent from a different perspective, but very much got the same ideas and the focus and the criticality of what we have here in our very high order consideration. This is one of the most important things that we all face. And for all of you investors out there, I hope it's on your agenda. If not after today, I hope it's there louder. If you have questions for anyone you've heard from today, then please do contact us. We'd be delighted to engage. And thank you again for coming to listen to what we've really enjoyed as a debate about one of the critical issues of our times. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.